Get there.
Did you not see
Is this thing on? All right.
There's all these syncopated notes that I did.
All right. We are glad to have you join us this evening.
What are you up to, Melita?
Yes. Go ahead and take your Bibles. Let's go to 1 Corinthians chapter 10. 1 Corinthians chapter 10. And we are in verse number 12. Paul has just finished talking to the church at Corinth about the murmuring of the children of Israel in the wilderness, right? And he's basically giving them an example of conduct not to follow, right? Let's not be murmurers, he says. And so when you take the book of 1 Corinthians all together as a whole, you really get the context in which Paul's talking about this really has to do with going back to chapter 1, right? Everybody fighting over who you should be following, right? Whether you should follow Paul or Apollos, or right, who's right, who's wrong, all that kind of stuff. And so, and the great thing about the Bible is nothing's changed, right? 2,000 years later, and we're still fighting over who we ought to follow, right? Everybody's got their little group, their little theological caveat. In fact, I was reading an excerpt from one guy's book. It was that a guy had written a book, and in that he had a quote from another guy's book, and the quote that he had from the other guy's book was quoting another guy's book. And it was basically on the evils of Ruckmanism, but and the guy, so the guy that was writing the new book, the newest book, he was writing in defense of Ruckman. The guy who he was quoting was writing derogatorily concerning Ruckman, and Ruckman was saying that you can get all the answers you need from an English dictionary. So, and I just thought, boy, if we aren't just about messed up enough to try to beat each other up over just about anything anymore. So, but this is what Paul's saying, right? Paul's saying, listen, we ought to conduct ourselves better as Christians, all right? And so I look back over my life as a Christian and as a pastor, and think to myself, there's a lot of areas in which I could have conducted myself better. I didn't need to jump to conclusions. I didn't need to hold people responsible for things that I assumed they meant rather than the things that they actually had said, right, and things like that. And so we very often very often do that. And so, in fact, was talking to somebody about the movie that had come out about the Jesus Revolution, and it's a cross section of Greg Laurie's life and some other, and Chuck Smith, and then the guy that actually wrote the article called the Jesus Revolution for the Time magazine. But I did not know some of the things that about Greg Laurie's life that come out kind of in that movie, right? And he had an interesting childhood, right? His mom's been divorced and remarried 7 times before she finally got saved, and she got saved after he got saved, and some of those things. And so sometimes we have a very pinhole view of the world, and so we interpret everything through that pinhole view without giving any context to anything else. And we do it very often for the right reasons, but it's still not an excuse when you look back, right, and you see that the disciples came to Jesus and said, hey, did you hear about those guys over there? They're casting out demons in your name, Jesus. You want us to go and shut that show down or what? All right, and Jesus said, hey, if they're not against me, they're for me. All right, and then he turns around later and says, they're not for me, they're against me. Right, so what did he expect us to have? He expected us to have some discernment, right? To be able to tell when somebody's doing something out of a genuine spirit of trying to do the right thing and for the right reasons, even though they may be doing the wrong thing, right? He expects us to, in fact, Brother Giff has an entire message on God thinks you're pretty smart, right? Because in one place in the Proverbs, he tells you, don't answer a fool according to his folly, right? But then he turns right around and tells you, but answer him according to his folly, because you don't want him to get wise in his own conceit, right? So, so God thinks you're pretty smart. God thinks you're smart enough to figure out when to answer and when not to, right? And so this is kind of what Paul's going over here with these guys. Obviously, it's a much more, it's a much smaller world that Paul's living in as far as the Christian world is concerned, because everything is still in the beginning phases here, and so there's not been a great deal of separation like we have today amongst us when it comes to denomination and our different theological views, right? There's a lot of them now. In fact, there's as many as there are pastors, honestly, right? No pastor completely agrees with any other pastor. In fact, most pastors don't completely agree with themselves in the future or in the past if you just talk to them long enough. Right? If you talk to a pastor long enough, here's what you're going to hear him say at some point. Well, I used to believe, right? And then he'll say something along this line as well. And right now I'm looking at such and such, and I'm not sure what I believe about that yet. So most pastors don't even agree with themselves in the present. So, so the reality of the matter is, but Paul says, listen, we ought not be murmurers. Right? Our goal, our objective, we're all in this, man, we should be pursuing, man, trying to glorify God by reaching others with the gospel, right? It's amazing how far we get from what Jesus said was basically, it's all the law and prophets is contained in two things, right? Love God, love others. And how far we can get away from that, right, and trying to kind of push forward our own thoughts and our own theological views sometimes, and sometimes it's not even theology. We just couch it in theology so that way we can make it biblical, and that's the reason that we're separating with you, when really we just don't like you. Right? We don't like the way you cut your hair. We don't like the fact that you do or don't wear a tie on Sunday, whatever it might be, right? I've heard as many messages about how wearing a tie on Sunday separates everybody, and so if you wear a tie on Sunday, it's just keeping people from coming to your church. Listen, ties haven't got anybody into church, and they sure aren't going to keep anybody out of church, right? And so it's all preference on some of that stuff. But anyway, so you come into verse number 12 here, 1 Corinthians chapter 10 and verse number 12, and he says here, wherefore let him that thinketh he standeth take heed lest he fall. So he's laid out in the first part of this chapter, first I guess about third of this chapter, he's laid out, don't act like this is behavior you ought not follow, right? And he follows that up with what? Hey, take heed, right? If you think you're standing, take heed lest you fall. And just about all of us have proven that verse at some point in our lives, haven't we? We were like, yeah, I'll tell you what I'd never do. And then God kicks your feet out from under you and you say, well, I was never gonna, right? But we always have a good reason for why we did it. The other guy did it because, he was just bad. But, we have a good reason why we did it. And so, which, by the way, he's going to follow up in this passage and say, no, you didn't. But anyway, so he tells you, right? He tells you pride is present. Right? That for let him that thinketh he standeth take heed lest he fall. You know what he's telling you? Pride's always present. Don't ever fool yourself, right? And the problem with pride is pride always gives the advantage to temptation. Right? Whenever you find yourself thinking too highly of yourself, you just mark it down. Temptation's got the advantage in that situation. And so, because pride makes you overconfident about your ability to overcome temptation. And you're going to end up falling because you think you're too good to fall. And I can look back over my life and I can look at the times that I thought I was really something, and it did not always work out that well. Right? And so, and we don't like it. We don't like pride in any arena except for our own little heart. Right? It's fine when we're proud, but we don't like it in anybody else. All right? Think people still hate Joe Namath. To this day, people hate Joe Namath. You know why? Because he said he was going to win the Super Bowl before he ever got in the game. All right? And so, and we've all watched it with different sporting and athletic events, right? You watch a team get on the basketball court, on the football field, on the hockey rink, whatever it is, man. You watch them get out there, right, on the pitch, because I'm so smart and I know soccer terms, right? But you watch them get out on the field, and you can tell when a team thinks they've already got it in the bag, and man, somehow that underdog just whoops them, just because they thought they had it in the bag. It's not because the underdog's a better team, right? It's because that team thought they had it in the bag. Pride will take your feet out from under you. And so he tells you, listen, just because you have had a victory over something, don't let that make you so proud that you think that you will always have the victory over that. The longer I'm in this thing of Christianity, of belief, the more that I realize that this thing's just one big fight, man. Sometimes you win and sometimes you lose. You haven't won every fight you've ever been in Christianity. You've not overcome every temptation in your life, right? You fall into the same temptation that you've overcome, and you've overcome the same temptation that you've fallen to, right? And most of the time, there's no difference between the two events, right? Like, it wasn't that the temptation was stronger this time than it was last time, or that it was weaker this time than it was last time. Most of the time, you couldn't even define what is different between the two events, right? Except that in one case, you know you trusted God, and in the other, you know you trusted yourself, right? Pride always will bring you to your knees. Hodges says, no degree of progress we may have already made, no amount of privilege which we may have enjoyed can justify the want of caution, right? And so what he says, it doesn't matter how much progress you think you've made, doesn't matter how many times you think you've overcome something, caution is still necessary, right? Just because you've driven back and forth to work successfully without getting in an accident, for a certain amount of time, doesn't mean that you can now throw caution to the wind, right? And just expect that the Red Seas are going to part for you, right? You still got to be cautious. And that's what he says here, right? And we all know that one, right? In fact, got a perfect reminder of it this morning, right? There's a back street kind of that leads out to Clay Street from my house, and so I always take that little street, right? Goes right down in front of the golf courses, right? And goes out that way. There's, 5 or 6 stop signs on that street, but in general, most of the time, there's nobody really coming out of those streets. And as you go, right, you just you do the old California roll stop, right? And I was following a truck in front of me, and we're coming up to the stop sign, and I look to my left as I'm rolling to my stop, and there's a motorcycle cop just sitting there on the street, just watching people come through that stop sign, right? Listen, I rolled right through it just like I always did, because I wasn't going to let him see me slam my brakes on, because that had just looked bad. So, right, you always want to just act like you didn't notice that they were there, and then you hope that they just were looking the other way. But he didn't pull me over, I know that. But he probably would have been justified in pulling me over, right? And so, and you know why I rolled through that stop sign? Because he's hardly ever there.
Wow.
Right, it's the same. It's the same reason we fall to temptation. Because hey, I hardly ever make a mistake in this space in my life, or this event in my life. I hardly ever fall here, right? And so it's not an excuse to throw caution to the wind. He says in the last part of that verse, he says, "Lest he fall." Right? What does that mean? It means that you're going to yield to temptation. Proverbs tells us pride goes before destruction and a haughty spirit before the fall, right? Listen, you're going to fall. You're not going to make it from where you're at right now to the end of your life without falling at some point. to temptation. All right? But that doesn't mean that you have an excuse for falling to temptation. Since I'm going to fall, right? It means, though, that you should limit the falls between here and there. And the way to limit the falls between here and there is to express extreme caution. Right? It's the same thing. You put a sports team on the field, right, or you put a team on the rink. Let me tell you what's going to happen in 99.9% of playoff games in the NHL. Both teams are going to score. You're not going to make it through the game. There's hardly ever shutouts in the playoffs. Hardly ever. Right? You're going to get scored on. You know what? If you go out on the ice and think to yourself, well, the entire plan tonight is for us not to get scored on, right? When that first goal goes in, you're going to be very disappointed, right? But just because you think you're going to get scored on is also not a reason to say, well, if we're going to get scored on anyways, let's just try and score more than the other team. That's also not a good plan, right? The idea is to use the opportunities that become available to you and limit the opportunities that the other team has. And that is what it is in the Christian life. Take advantage of the times when it doesn't seem like there's much temptation, but limit the temptations the times that are available for temptation in your life as well. He says, lest he fall there. Also means that word lest means that he doesn't have to fall. But temptation, if temptation takes its full course, you will. Right? And so be careful. He tells you in verse number 13, there hath no temptation take you, but such as is common to man. But God is faithful, who will not suffer you to be tempted above that ye are able, but will with the temptation also make a way to escape, that ye may be able to bear it. This is probably the fullest description of the problem with temptation, right? And the method of overcoming it in all of Scripture. We hear about temptation in a lot of other places, but if you were going to say, listen, I'm going to make a stance on a doctrinal position on temptation, this is where you would take it from. Right? So here's Paul's doctrinal stance on temptation. First of all, he tells you it's common. No temptation has taken you, but such as is common to man, he tells you, right? So he says, there hath no temptation taken you, but such as is common to man. So you know what that means? That means temptation is common. There's nobody sitting in this room that's above it. Nobody sitting in this room that's below it. Also tells you that you're not above temptation. You're not better than temptation is, and you're not worse than temptation. That guy never has to worry about temptation because he just gives in to everything. No, that guy's still got temptations too. It also tells you that whatever you're faced with is common. You're not so special, right? Sometimes the world will blow sunshine at you and tell you that you've got it worse than everybody else. And so that's why you face the things that you face. Right? And the reason that you have the temptations you have in your life is because you're special, and nobody else has faced what you've faced or gone through what you've gone through. No, Paul says that's a lie. Temptation is common to man. So what does that tell you? It tells you this: I may not face the exact same temptation you face, and you may not face the exact same temptation that I face, but there's enough other human beings on the face of this planet that have faced the exact same temptation that you face, that face the exact same temptation that I face, that it is common among men. And so when I give into it, I have no excuse for giving into it. And when you give into it, you have no excuse for giving into it either. At least not that one. All right? So, a lot of times, right, we get ourselves thinking that, man, we've been tempted worse than anybody else has been tempted, or something like that. The thing to remember in the midst of temptation is, right, that temptation is not a weakness. In fact, temptation is a sign of strength. If you are tempted to do something, that means you have not done it. That is a show of strength. May not be much strength, right? You may be hanging on by a thread, but it's strength nonetheless. If you had done it, there'd be no temptation. Right? So temptation is a sign technically of strength. And it's important to remember that temptation is not the sin. The sin is in yielding to temptation. The temptation itself is not the problem. The giving in to the temptation is the problem. Right? But temptation is common. We live in a day and age where they have so individualized everything that there is no such thing as commonness anymore, right? We don't have any common agreement on anything, right? We can't even define what a woman is or what a man is in our day and age because there's nothing as common, right? But the reality is, human beings are pretty common. We're pretty similar. Yeah, your life has had some ups that other people's lives have not had. And you've had some downs that other people haven't had. But listen, if you've had downs that other people haven't had, but you've had ups that other people haven't had, then you have no excuse. Just like they don't. For every kid that's out there that's ever been abused, there's a million other kids out there that have been abused too. So there's no excuse for how that kid turns out. Now, it may help you to understand, right? It may help you on your side to deal with that kid or to deal with that individual because you understand their background and so you know better how to help them to overcome some things in their life. There's not a problem even with you personally in your own life because of some things that you may have faced. Understanding why you have the temptations that you have because of the things that have taken place in your life. That's perfectly fine, but when it goes from being an explanation to being an excuse, you have a problem. And too often we excuse our giving into our temptation. We excuse it based on our past, based on the things that we've gone through, based on, if I had money, I wouldn't have this temptation to rob the bank. And so that we start to give ourselves excuses for why we do the things that we do. And the explanation for why you're tempted to rob the bank may be because you don't have money. That may be an explanation. But it's also not an excuse. There's a lot of other people on the face of this planet that don't have money that don't rob banks. Right? And so he tells you, secondly, he says, how do you control the temptation? God is faithful, who will not suffer you to be tempted above that you are able. The most disappointing words in the English language right there. All right? You always had a reason. You always had the ability to not do it. God's never let you be tempted beyond your ability to say no. So anytime that you've said no, you know who said no? Or who said yes? I mean, every time that you've said yes to a temptation, you know who said yes? You did. And you did it because you wanted to. I was watching a short clip by, I think it was by a preacher, but it was on a podcast, but he was making the statement. He says, you know why you have the sin problem you have? Because you love it. That's why you have it. It's because you love it. He said, I know that as soon as it's over, you don't love it. Then you're full of shame and guilt about it, and you hate that you did it. But you don't hate it enough to not love it the next time it comes around. And listen, that's the reality, right? God's never let you be tempted beyond your ability to say no. And so that means that when we fall as a result of temptation, it's because we rested in our own strength and our own ability to overcome it. And we know that. Right? You know that because you know when you've been tempted and you've thought to yourself, just, God, I wish that I could say no to this. Right? And you hear that little voice go, so just say no. right? Or just trust me. You ever heard that one in the back of your mind before? Well, just trust me. Right? And you go, oh, I want to trust you, but I also really like chocolate cake. Right? And then you find yourself sitting there, right? Wow, just too much for me to overcome. If it had been one slice of chocolate cake, I probably could overcome that. But a whole chocolate cake just sitting there uncut, somebody had to do something about that. You can't just leave it like that. Right? And so, listen, the principle is very simple. What Paul says, here's the doctrine of temptation. God's never tempted you beyond your ability. Period. Full stop. End of story. So every fall you've ever had was not anybody else's fault. Even if there was somebody else involved in the sin with you, it wasn't their fault that you fell. Well, if they hadn't been there, if they hadn't tempted me, if they hadn't encouraged me, if they hadn't told me, if they hadn't drawn me into it, no, it was you. Just you. And then he tells you, so he says, what's the conquering? How do you conquer temptation? He tells you in the last part there, with the temptation, also, right, make a way to escape that you may be able to bear it, God says. Think about what that says. He makes a way for you to escape so that you're relieved of the burden. That is not what that verse says. He said he made a way for you to escape so that you can put up with the temptation. Here's the way we want it to go. I'm tempted. I say, God, please take this temptation away. The thought leaves my mind. That's the way we want it to go, isn't it? And that's why we blame God for why we gave into temptation. I did pray, and I still wanted to do it. And so we blame God. That's the reason I gave into my temptation. No, the reason you gave into your temptation is because God said, I'll let you bear it. And you said, I don't want to bear it. God said, you want to know what the escape is? Just put up with it. Just bear it. You know what temptation is? It's a burden to be borne. It's not something we say things like, well, resist the devil, right? And he'll flee, right? All this other, and I agree with all that stuff. The problem is the devil doesn't stay away. And when we say he flees, it's kind of like when a military retreats. Why does a military retreat? To regroup. That's all. The devil's never left your eyesight. He's always been just on the horizon. Right? And the way that you put up with the temptation is you bear it. You just bear it. That's what you do. You say no, and you say no, and you say no, and you just bear it. It's a song, I'm trying to think of Donnie McClurkin sings it, the black preacher. He sings a song called Stand, right? I personally like black gospel music, so you don't have to like it. But if I had my druthers, I'd have a black gospel choir. So, but Donnie McClurkin sings a song called Stand, right? And he says, man, when you've done it all, and all you've got left to do, right? You've done all you can, then all you can do is stand. And that's what it is to overcome temptation. Is just stand. You just got to bear it. You know what the escape is? The escape isn't run from it, hide from it, right? Duck this corner, duck that corner, right? You know how many messages I've heard in my lifetime on temptation and how, well, if you want, what you need to do is you need to just avoid temptation, right? And you kind of, and really what we're saying when we say that is you just got to hide from it. Figure out where temptation's going to be and just go down the other side of the street. The problem is, temptation isn't on one side of the street or the other. Temptation follows you around. Temptation's got your number. And you may get away from it for a moment, but it's going to catch up with you eventually. And so you're right. If you're in the path of temptation, move. But don't think that it's not going to find where you move to. Right? And if temptation's following you, then you should probably pick up the pace. But don't think you're going to outrun it. Eventually the time's going to come in your life when you're just going to have to, when you will have done all you can to avoid temptation, and you're just going to have to bear it and still say no. And listen to your mind tell you all the reasons why you'd be perfectly justified to give in, and you're still going to have to say no. That's what it comes down to. That's what it is to face temptation. We come up with a million ways to avoid temptation, and in the end, what you find out is you can't avoid temptation because you know where temptation's at? It's in you. It's with you everywhere you go. It's the same thing I tell people when they decide that they want to get divorced. Well, I'll just divorce him. I'll just divorce her. Oh, that's great. But the problem is, you are the problem, and you are going to be in the next marriage too. And you'll find the same problems in your next marriage that you found in your first marriage because you are in it too. And that's the problem with that we have when we think to ourselves that somehow we're just going to outpace temptation. We're just going to run fast enough to get away from it. Or we're just going to change our habits. That's going to fix it for us. No. It's probably not. You know what's going to fix it? What's going to fix it is facing it and bearing it. Probably the best analogy that you can come up with is this, and that is, if you ever had to put up with a bully in your life, you ran from him, but you didn't always get away. Tried to avoid him, but you couldn't always avoid him. At some point, even though you knew you were going to lose a tooth, you just had to stand up. Right? You just had to take the shot. And yep, he probably busted you in your mouth. But you know what you found out? Found out you could stand up to him. You found out that, you know what? It hurts. But that's better than running. It's one of the problems that I have with a lot of the present, right? And I'm not for bullying by any stretch of the imagination, but I'm also not for the whole present anti-bullying this, anti-bullying that. Let me tell you something. That kid's going to get out of school and find out that there's bullies outside of school and there's no teacher to protect you. You're going to go to work and find out there's bullies at work. And you just have to stand up and say, yeah, no, I'm not doing that. Not what I do. They're everywhere. There's bullies at the gas station. There's bullies at the bank. Most of them become politicians. Right? But there's bullies all over the place. And what you find out about, man, the only way to overcome a bully is to stand up to him, even if you lose. And the only way to overcome temptation is to continually say no, take a stand. You're not going to win them all, but you're going to win them. And that's what Paul says here. He says, quit blaming God. God has adequately given you the ability to overcome your temptation. He's given you the ability to bear it. It's not too heavy, and you're not too weak. You can't overcome it. You say, well, now I don't feel better about myself. Now I feel like a load of garbage because I give in to my temptation. Well, what does giving into your temptation do for you, just out of curiosity? Every time you give into it, what do you feel like? You feel like a load of garbage. Can't believe I did that. Can't believe I gave in. Well, as long as you're going to feel like garbage, you may as well feel like garbage by bearing it instead of giving into it. Listen, you're going to feel bad either way. may as well feel bad by standing up to it instead of giving into it. That's what Paul says here. We're going to cut off there. We'll pick up in verse number 14 next week. Let's go ahead and pray. Lord, we love you. We're thankful for the Word of God. I pray, God, that I said everything I should have said. Pray I didn't say anything I shouldn't have. And I pray, God, you've been glorified now. In Jesus' name, amen. Thanks for being here tonight. We will see you on Sunday morning.